Have the greatest computer, but if you have cruddy software and you put lousy information into it, you're going to get lousy performance and lousy information out. What we have been doing here in this country for the last 50 to 60 years has been changing the history of the country and the focus of studies that have gone on in the public school system. And as a result, today's millennials are woefully ignorant of the actual history of the country. And all of this factors into politically correct causes such as Black Lives Matter. You would swear that there is this epidemic on the part of police departments around the country to kill black people or to abuse black people, et cetera, et cetera. We know the whole shtick, but the facts don't show that. That's the problem. Look at this. Every year, approximately 6,000 people who are African Americans are murdered. This is a number that's greater than the white and Hispanic homicide victims combined in the country, because even though blacks are only 13% of the national population, they are killed at 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. For example, in Los Angeles, blacks between the ages of 20 and 24 die at a rate of 20 to 30 times the national average. Now you could say, wow, this is real discrimination. There's a whole war on to exterminate black people here in this country, which if it were true would be really tragic. Now these deaths are tragic, but who's killing them? It's not the police, among which you have mixed races in cities like Los Angeles, not white civilians, but other blacks. It's black death by black homicide. It's a major function of the black crime rate. Black males between the ages of 14 and 17 commit homicide at 10 times the rate of white and Hispanic male teens combined. Blacks of all ages commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined, and 11 times the rate of whites alone. But if you were to deal with these statistics, then the Black Lives Matter movement wouldn't count. So what's going on here? Well, it's a desperate lack of information and or history of the country, starting with the whole idea of racism, with which the country is now obsessed as far as a litmus test, versus social outcomes, where various elites would like to drag us. And knowing how the political dialectic works, they used issues such as Black Lives Matter or whatever the cause happens to be as a stepping stone to further objectives, oftentimes damaging the very people that they are claiming to protect. Historian Dr. Dennis Cuddy is a former senior associate at the U.S. Department of Education. He has written many books on the subject of globalism, the power elites, and the history of education, in quotes, by the elites themselves, so you understand where they pointed us. And Dennis, we are being treated to a nonstop parade of issues about which much brouhaha is made, pulling down the statues of Civil War generals, the Confederate flag, Black Lives Matter, what civil rights were originally intended to be versus where the redefinitions of rights have brought us to this day. And it's all based on a large ignorance of our history. But it isn't necessarily the fault of the populace, because the history has been radically changed in the textbooks over the last 5 decades. And many of them have just been pregnant with false information. However, did we get here?
Well, there's generally been a lot of hypocrisy, especially on what you would call the political left. I remember some years ago, about 15 years or so ago, there was a scandal during the Clinton years about the communist Chinese trying to influence our elections through financial contributions.
Yeah.
And we were outraged, and then I remember looking at the New York Times and it said, and we're putting up $5 million to sort of rig the election in Yugoslavia. That was perfectly all right, but it was outrageous for anybody to try to hear, but we were good to go in terms of overthrowing other governments through helping groups in opposition to the established order. And so if you look back, it depends on who's writing the history. They say to the victor belongs the spoils, as well as the writing of the historical events as they supposedly occurred. But what happened was, I call them psychological probes. People are presented with certain activities in the news and as historical facts, and it's okay to look at them like that because that's the way our perception is shaped. But I also encourage them to look at it from the view that there's this powerful group of people, I call them the power elite, who have been for many, many years manipulating events, manipulating the news, creating crises so that you'll have a public reaction that they desire. And they oftentimes have what I call psychological probes. It's testing the public to see how well they're doing, how well the power elite is conditioning the people, getting them to move towards socialism, which is the ultimate goal of the world socialist government and so on.
Let me jump in. We do have to do a station break. I ran long on the opening on the show. Dr. Dennis Cuddy, my guest right now. Where did all of this historic misinformation come from, and where is it leading us? We're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Lefter, and the program is Steel on Steel. We were talking about the power elite, especially this long-term elitist push towards global governance, global socialism, as we've been calling it here. I've called it global pantheistic socialism because there is a religious element to it, where everything that's tolerant will be tolerated, but things that state things absolutely will not be tolerated. And I've been saying that for years now. You can see this emerging right now. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lefter here with you. Former senior associate at the U.S. Department of Education and historian, Dr. Dennis Cuddy, is with me right now. Speaking of the power elites, I don't know if you just happened to notice that a meeting between Henry Kissinger and Donald Trump. Henry has been very busy lately as a representative of the power elite, shuttling back and forth behind the scenes. I'm sure that the power elite will now explain to Mr. Trump exactly what things are going to be should he become elected. Mr. Kissinger was over meeting with Mr. Putin, discussing the future of the new economy that would come about after the blowout of the dollar as the world's currency and the next currency crises that are coming upon us. Anyway, you were talking about the power elite. Let's get back to the whole issue of how the educational elite here in this country have managed to change the history of the country, and then how this change of history and understanding of it affects what's going on in politics today, usually by floating trial balloons.
From time to time, they have these various tests to see if the public has become dumbed down enough or ignorant enough to be able to move in a particular direction. And they'll use wars. There was an article in the July 1792 issue of American Museum, which is a popular publication of the day, where this lesser-known founding father named Philip Freneau showed how these powerful people, he called them a hereditary elite at the time, actually were going to regain control of the United States. The U.S. had become an independent republic, and these powerful people didn't like that. So he wasn't with them. He was trying to help us understand what they would be up to. And he was really very accurate. He said they would call something the general welfare. So if you opposed them, you'd be opposing the general welfare. They would get us into no-win wars, which they did. In Vietnam, the polling just at the early stages of Vietnam showed that patriotism was a very highly valued trait of a person. But toward the end, I think the poll was in the mid-70s, Yankelovich took a poll and found that among 18 to 29-year-olds, only about 26% thought patriotism was a highly valued trait to have, which told the power elite that they were very successful in their plan, which was to lessen national patriotism or nationalism, because if you're going to create a world socialist government, you have to be able to transfer allegiance from your nation to this larger entity, this world federal government. So they do this every once in a while. Now, in terms of race, what you would find is the way a particular psychological probe, for example, would be the relatively recent, about a year ago, attack upon the Confederate flag. That was a psychological probe. And most people just look at it as, okay, here's an event and here's what happens. And that's okay, because that's the way the news is presenting it. But what you really should do is look at it from the perspective of how would that further the power elite's goal. What they would do is try to diminish or test the willingness of people to forsake something that they value. In this particular situation, it would be the Southerners and their Southern heritage. And most people don't have the slightest clue outside the South what's going on. For example, most people don't know that the song Dixie was Lincoln's favorite song. You know, they think, oh, Dixie, it's a Confederate song. This is horrible. And so, no, it was Lincoln's favorite song. And so the situation is presented. It's a probe. It's a test to see if South Carolina, whatever, will, do away with the cherished flag. And so what happens is the leader of our nation, in his vast ignorance, President Obama, literally made a statement, we fought a civil war to end, slavery. Well, no, we didn't fight a civil war to end slavery. That's the way it's presented, and that's the way the media tells the public, and that's the way the ignorant public looks at it, because they've been dumbed down. They have no clue.
So if we didn't fight it over slavery, which it really wasn't over slavery, that was an entangled issue, what was the real issue?
Well, the background on it is right from the get-go. You had the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists at the beginning of the country. And when the Constitution was first presented to the public, the Jeffersonians were the Anti-Federalists. They believed in a sort of agrarian, rural, everybody independent farmer types. And the Hamiltonians believed in a strong central government, a central bank. And he felt that we needed that because we were going to face adversaries in England and France and Spain and wherever. And so you needed a strong central government. So when the Constitution was first written, it was actually rejected by the public. Now, most people don't know that, but it was rejected until the Anti-Federalists were assured with the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, that they would not have a strong central government. There were only 4 cabinet officers at the beginning of the country. And it was very important to have freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And the 10th Amendment wasn't just a throwaway. It was basically a states' rights amendment. It said all powers not specifically designated in the Constitution as belonging to the federal government were reserved to the individuals and the states. And Jefferson even made a big deal of that when he came up with that phrase in 1802 to the Danbury Baptist about the separation of church and state. He caught a blaze of criticism over that, and he quickly said, no, you don't understand. All I meant by that is what the original purpose of the Bill of Rights was. I don't want the federal government intervening into the states and individuals' religions within the states. It had nothing to do with what the positivists, which is an outgrowth of the Illuminati and French Revolution, had done to create the current use of that term, separation of church and state. It had nothing to do with that at all. In fact, Massachusetts, a liberal state today, was using tax dollars to support the Congregationalist church in that state until 1838. Way 50 years beyond the Constitution, tax dollars were going for a particular religion in a particular state. So it had nothing to do with what the Supreme Court has done. Now, in terms of race, what happened was, in general, currently, the South has been trying, okay, these reactionary, racist, Confederates and so forth. Now, they used the word Confederacy because they wanted the Articles of Confederation. That's what the Southerners wanted to go back to because they were anti-Federalists who felt that the North had violated the contract being the Bill of Rights with the Constitution. There were various pieces of legislation involved. We won't have to go into that. And they had, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and there was the doctrine of nullification with Clay and Calhoun saying, if there's a federal law that violates the Bill of Rights and states' rights, we don't have to abide by it. So this was an ongoing controversy right from the beginning. And so if you want to talk about racism, you could say that everybody was a racist. It wasn't just the South. Everybody, Benjamin Franklin, right from the beginning, said it'd be better if Anglo-Saxons dominated the world. It wasn't so much let's look down upon those blacks. It was a feeling of the Anglo-Saxon race in general, including in the North, felt that they were superior to everybody. They were superior to Hispanics, to Chinese, to blacks, to American Indians, everybody. So there was this pervasive notion of a racial superiority. They justified it scientifically because in the middle of the 1800s you had Darwinism and Herbert Spencer and survival of the fittest, and you had social Darwinism coming about. And so everybody was being the Enlightenment, and we were into science, and it would apply to human beings as well as to animals, these superior lions and all that sort of stuff. Well, they're superior people. And it wasn't a put down, it was just a scientific fact. We're the best breeding, we have the best education, we're the most cultured. Now, to prove that it wasn't so much a racist thing is, years ago, like 200-300 years ago, Africans were welcomed in Europe if they were elite, the kings and queens and all that, and they were highly educated and highly cultured. They were treated very well. So it wasn't so much what we consider today a racist sort of thing, like it's just anti-black. It was sort of a class or culture elitism that was pervasive, and it applied to all races.
But obviously today the perception is quite different.
Today, because the public was ignorant, said, we got to get rid of that Confederate flag. Well, if you want to get rid of any flag, we should have gotten rid of the U.S. flag, because Lincoln had written a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper back at the time of the Civil War, saying, look, if I can save the Union without freeing a single slave, that's what I'll do. So he wasn't really going into this conflict as a matter of we have to fight to free those slaves. In fact, the Southerners weren't doing that either. Only 7% of the South owned slaves. 93% of Southerners were dirt farmers who didn't own any slaves at all, and they weren't